and our colleague will relay it to me. Okay, then we will start from all three speakers and then proceed with the Q&A session afterwards. Without further ado, I would like to invite our associate researcher, Mas Andre Suryanta, to give a maximum 15-minute presentation to open our discussion today. To Mas Andre, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Pinkan, and very happy to be here. And thank you to our fellow panelists, Ibu Clarice and Pak Denny, for coming to share the stage with me today. Let me just share my presentation on the screen. Okay, I hope that shows up okay.
Yes.
I'm trying to put it, okay, full screen. Yeah, so as Pinkan has mentioned, this is actually part of our policy paper. So today I'll be presenting half of our policy paper. The other half will be presented by my co-author, and hopefully you look forward to that. And today we'll be talking about this leveraging IA-CEPA to create education powerhouse. So the powerhouse term has been mentioned several times also by government representative, and I'll explain to you as we go along. So a quick refresher, as Pinkan has mentioned, we did a webinar on this last year. So I won't go through in more detail. If you want more detail on the structure of IA-CEPA, you can look at that webinar. And bilaterally, both countries, Indonesia and Australia, we enjoy close diplomatic relationship, but economic-wise, it's still quite low. Now, for IA-CEPA in particular, in the investment provisions, we noticed that the human capital seems to be the focus for Indonesia. In that, there are much better terms, much better provisions for the subsector of higher education and healthcare. Right? And indeed, there's some early outcomes indicate that this is the case. We see Australian universities coming to Indonesia to set up campuses or establishing cooperation, and Australian healthcare providers entering into cooperation with Indonesian state-owned enterprises. Well, since our webinar in June 2020, we know that COVID-19 pandemic has really raged across the world, and basically both economies, Indonesia and Australia, like many other economies in the world, went into recession. Right? Australia chose to close its borders to international travelers. So no international travelers are allowed in the country since March 2020, I believe. And in Indonesia itself, about 2.5 million Indonesians lost their jobs, and a lot more experienced reduced income. However, during that period, also in 2020, there was one major investment reform that takes place in Indonesia, and that is the passing of the job creation law, or in Indonesian, we call it Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja. And one of the implementing regulation is Presidential Regulation 10/2021 on investment, which actually will also influence the higher education space, as I will explain later. So when we look at the powerhouse concept, this is actually a concept that is inspired by the global value chain approach. Right now, COVID-19 itself has disrupted global value chains operation with border closures and mobility restriction. A lot of global value chain are facing difficulty sourcing their materials or intermediate goods, right? So a lot of experts in the initial stage of COVID-19 believe that GVC will roll back, right? A lot of this global cooperation will return home and just shorten the supply chain and bring it back home. But now we are a little over a year through the pandemic, and what we're seeing is more on regional nearshoring, right? So instead of reshoring, it's more of a nearshoring, where this global cooperation indeed try to shorten the supply chain, but doing it more on a regional context, so regional production hubs to serve different regions around the world. And we believe that this should be also how IA-CEPA be utilized, right? So instead of just focusing on bilateral trade investment between Indonesia and Australia, it should be aimed at creating a collaboration between these two countries, forming a powerhouse. And it's illustrated in the picture below. Basically, it's combining Australian complementary strength with Indonesia. In this case, could be Australian materials or services processed in Indonesia or provisioned in Indonesia to supply export market. So we see that there are two sectors that are quite ready to do this. And first is the Agrifood Powerhouse, right? We know that Australian agricultural industry is very strong, and Indonesia have a very strong food processing industry. So combining these two, just for example, in the instant noodle industry, right? I mean, Indonesia is one of the largest exporter of instant noodle to Asia and Africa, and it's using Australian input, which is wheat. So we believe this model is ready to be transferred to other products such as meat-based food or even halal food, right? The second sector that we see readiness is the higher education powerhouse. And in this sense, the Australian universities providing their services to Indonesian campuses, not just to Indonesian students, but also to students from other countries, right? And I'll be focusing on the second one. As I said, the first one, the Agrifood Powerhouse, will be discussed with my co-author in another webinar, right? So in terms of the higher education sector, let's look at Australia and Indonesia, right? For university education in Australia, COVID-19 has definitely impacted its international education sector. Between 2019 and 2020, there's a big drop in the economic contribution, 2.8 billion, but half of it is still recovered, managed to recover through the online tuition fee. So these are international students. They're still paying Australian universities tuition fee, but studying from their own home country. However, this might be the case for ongoing students, right? And these ongoing students probably try to save their spot in expectation of Australian border reopening. But we all heard recently from Australian Education Minister that it's probably unlikely that Australia will open its borders for international students until next year. So then this model of remote learning becomes a little bit shaky. And of course, this is important because education is a big export of Australia, the fourth largest export, and universities hosted 46% of these international students. And a lot of these students, of course, come from Asia. Now, in terms of higher education in Indonesia, this is a chart from OECD that shows sort of, the higher education sector, a snapshot in Indonesia. And Pinkan already mentioned just now that only about 16% of Indonesian youth in university age actually goes to university, mostly taking bachelor degree, but that's pretty common to any countries. And it's very strong domestically focused, right? If you see on the chart to the right here, so basically the share of international students or foreign students in Indonesia is almost non-existent, it's very small. And out of that 16% that goes to university, only 1% goes abroad, right? So from Australian universities, actually Australian University enjoys reputational benefit in Indonesia, right? It's the #1 most favorite destination for Indonesian students that want to study abroad. But even being most favorite, it only accounts for about 10,000 students, to be honest. If you see it on the chart to the right there, Indonesia is about #7, right? The biggest cohort comes from China and India. So that 10,000 stands in contrast with the millions of university age students in Indonesia that haven't gone to university, or those that are coming up to university age very soon. But remember now, 99% of these students usually stay in Indonesia, even if they enroll in university. So there's a rethink needed here if Australian universities want to really increase engagement significantly with Indonesian students, right? And even the Education Minister of Australia, Alan Tudge, also says that this disruption of 2020 forces a rethink of the onshore, on-campus international education model. So on the Indonesian side, of course, the idea is in terms of inviting for a university is to improve investment in terms of capital, or also the quality of the education sector. But when we go back to the OECD chart, 16% market size is sizable, but probably less appealing compared to, let's say, 45%. So definitely it's good if we can bump up the domestic enrollment number, right? And that's one of the way to address this. But in itself, this low enrollment rate has been around for a while, and it's probably symptomatic of other issues or other reforms that's necessary, right? So in the short term, if to increase this market potential, there is a potential to actually increase the intake of foreign students. As I already mentioned before, the number of foreign students in Indonesia is very small. There is potential to increase this, right? And this provides benefit both to local and foreign universities. Of course, the local universities now potentially get more students, right? And with more students available, of course, the foreign universities are more likely to invest in Indonesia. And indeed, this is what Malaysia actually did. And I'll explain in the next few slides. So back in 2006, Malaysia began opening up its higher education sector, inviting foreign universities to set up in Malaysia. And so universities from Europe, Asia, and Australia setting up campuses in Malaysia. And on the demand side, it's actually Malaysia makes it easy for foreign students to come to Malaysia, and even at the initial stage, subsidize some of the costs. So this creates an environment where that's beneficial for everyone, because the local students, of course, they have more option. They can study at international brand or international renowned universities in their backyard. But they also found that the local universities then, in trying to keep up with their recruitment, increases their quality of education services, right? So local students have more option and more quality. Now, local universities benefit from the larger student cohort, because now they get international students which they can recruit, and international student that chose to study in Malaysia in a foreign university is doing so because of the lower living costs compared to if they study in the university's country of origin. And overall, the country is the biggest winner. Malaysia became the 9th largest higher education provider back in 2014, right? Since 2014. And basically, it's a new export industry for Malaysia. It's attracting over 1,000 international students each year. And even compared to its near neighbors, Malaysia welcomed more foreign students than Malaysians studying abroad, as you can see on the chart here. Even compared to Singapore, which is also known for their universities. So when we look at what the Malaysian government do in the demand side in terms of facilitating students to come to the country, we see that we notice that one of the problem probably exists in Indonesia is this complicated procedure for students to come and study. And I will go through and compare this now. First, of course, students have to receive a letter of offer from the university, right? And from that letter of offer, they apply for a student permit from the Ministry of Education. And with that student permit, then they apply for a limited stay visa to the immigration department. Now, upon receiving the visa, they can travel to Indonesia, but that does not mean they're allowed to stay in Indonesia. So in Indonesia, they have to present their visas to an immigration office to get a limited stay permit, EETAS, right? So after getting this, of course, they can stay and study. However, the process didn't end there. A few years later, after they complete their education, they need to cancel their EETAS by applying for an exit permit, right? So it has to be a manually closing the loop. Now in Malaysia, of course, the process starts the same, also with a letter on offer, apply for a student visa. And once they receive a student visa, they can travel to Malaysia. If they are from a visa-free country that has arrangement with Malaysia, like ASEAN countries, they can just go to Malaysia directly. If they don't come from those type of countries, they need a single entry visa. And this is just a regular single entry travel visa, not a special type of visa like a limited stay visa. Then upon arrival in Malaysia, they just need to go to the university and enroll. And the university will then liaise with the immigration department to get the foreigner ID card. Right? So the process is much simpler. It's much less steps for the students to go through. Right? Now, for the Australian provider, or Australian universities that's not considering Indonesia, you need to consider also there are some domestic distraction that might be coming up, right? As we see, the low enrollment numbers probably indicates a broader reform is needed in the higher education. But at the moment, the Indonesian government is quite busy with Undang-Undang Cipta Kerja. This is a huge law, and it has 50+ implementing regulations. So then it has to be adjusted or synchronized with other regulations as well, other older regulations. So there might be a lot of resources dedicated to that. and not so much left for reforming the higher education sector in Indonesia. And secondly, IA-CEPA did provide early advantage for the Australian universities, right? Because previously the higher education sector is close to, it's restricted to foreign investor. But the new Perpres 10/2021 on investment removed education services from the restriction list, which means it's now open for all investors, not just Australian. So the early advantage that Australian universities have under IA-CEPA might be diminishing soon. And we have heard that other countries are starting to knock on the Ministry of Education doors to ask about this, right? So last, I would just highlight some policy recommendations from our policy paper. So basically, in terms of higher education, Indonesia should really have a global outlook, right? Instead of just trying to think about the domestic students, but try to have a global strategy and increase inbound international students. Of course, firstly, by streamlining visa and permitting process. On the other hand, Australian universities have reputational benefit. It's very well known in Indonesia, but that probably needs to be brought into the Indonesian market, has to be provided through a campus in Indonesia, just because the Indonesian market characteristic is domestically focused. And lastly, IA-CEPA is a really good start. We see a very positive start here. But we hope that it can be expanded to identify broader reforms in other human capital investment space, like vocational education or even healthcare that I already mentioned much earlier. So that concludes my presentation for today, and we do hope that you'll enjoy reading our policy paper. Thank you, Pinkan. Back to you.
Thank you, Mas Andre. It's really interesting to see your presentation. And thanks also for sharing the cover of our paper so the participants can also download it in the chat box through the link that Dira already shared. And also for those joining in YouTube, they can also find that in our website. And perhaps just to sum up several things that you already mentioned. So basically through the IA-CEPA, we have the opportunity to expand our human capital development in terms of the investment, and also to help the Indonesian people to access higher education, quality education. And then to go there are so many things that to be working on, like the thing that related to the immigration process and also the permit for the students. And also there are many things are going on, like the omnibus law that also affected the investment for the higher education, and that's really interesting situation at the moment. And now we are going to move forward and hear the explanation from our next speaker. It is Pak Denny Kurniawan, a representative from Ministry of Education and Culture, and he will share more about what's going on in the higher education in Indonesia at the moment. So for Pak Denny, I think you can start and activate the video first. I think Pak Denny already joined us, or if, okay, perhaps if we still have technicalities issues, we can move forward to our next speakers first. Clarice Campbell, a senior lead advisor from Catalyst at Cardno. So yeah, I think I can move a little bit of the arrangement. So we will go from Clarice Campbell before we proceed with Pak Denny, if that's okay. Yeah, I think Clarice, you may start.
Yep, okay, that's all right. Sometimes there are technical issues and these things happen. So I'm just gonna share my screen. All right, is that coming up for everybody?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, hi everyone. My name is Clarice Campbell and I am the lead advisor for skills at Cardno in Jakarta. And I'm working on the Catalyst program for the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies for inviting me to speak today. And I'd also like to acknowledge our other distinguished guests on the call today, Pak Denny Kurniawan from the Ministry of Education and Culture, and Pak Andre Suryanta from CIPS, as well as Mbak Pinkan Ondrin as our moderator for today. Okay, so many of you will be asking, what is Catalyst? Catalyst is a government-backed Indonesia-Australia business development catalyst. We identify, promote, and fund activities that accelerate opportunities between Indonesia-Australia businesses with the goal of strengthening inclusive growth and prosperity. At the moment, the team is being brought together. I myself have only been in my role for a week, but we're really excited to get started on implementing activities that realize complementary trade, investment, and inclusive development opportunities under the IA-CEPA. So, sort of a significant opportunity exists to align Australia's high quality TVET sector with the skills needs of the Indonesian labour force. Training providers have faced major obstacles supporting the Indonesian labour market. And while the Indonesian private sector faces challenges finding the skills that they need, as part of its role to help catalyse new economic opportunities and growth in both countries, the Catalyst program will aim to connect Indonesian industry with high quality Australian skills and training to address major constraints around growth and productivity in Indonesia. So partnerships between Indonesian industry and Australian registered training organisations, or RTOs, will be created to meet the skills needs identified by Indonesian industry bodies. And this presents significant opportunities to address this skills gap. So this is something that the Catalyst team will be working really hard on. So what are the initial skills focus areas for cooperation under Catalyst? There have been 3 areas identified in the first year. So that's digital economy, health, and tourism. Around digital economy, everybody knows that Indonesia's digital economy is growing at a really rapid rate. It's expected by 2025 that it will be worth over US 124 billion, which is big. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been a surge in consumer demand in this area. We see a lot more sellers establishing online stores and an increasing number of consumers jumping onto these online platforms. So this is an area where skills are really needed. On top of this, around health, actually fewer people are going physically to the doctors to seek health advice. So this has generated an increased demand due to the ease of access for this sort of thing through apps and other online platforms. So apps like HelloDoc and Good Doctor, you know, they've seen incredible growth in Indonesia, and they would really benefit from tapping into Australia's expertise and supply in medical technology and healthcare training in this area. And then finally, tourism. Obviously, tourism was very heavily hit by the pandemic, and overall visits to Indonesia were down by 78% in 2020 compared to 2019, with basically an effective loss of 100% of Australian tourists, which are a significant element of tourists that visit Indonesia. But because tourism is a core industry for Indonesia, it will be a key feature for its economic recovery response. And because Australia does have significant expertise in this sector, there is scope for cooperation in this area. So these are the key questions that I've been asked to touch on today. So we're going to be looking at, what does the IA-CEPA say about skills? What is the demand for Australian skills in Indonesia? What are the opportunities for skills providers in Indonesia? Will the delivery of Australian education increase the quality of skills in Indonesia? And how can Indonesia attract high quality skills providers to help address this? So what does the IA-CEPA say about skills? It says quite a bit. I haven't highlighted higher education here just because the main focus is actually around vocational education and other smaller short course skills. But just on higher educations, as Andre touched on earlier, universities can establish themselves anywhere in Indonesia, and they don't need to actually be in special education zones or economic zones or things like that. So that is one thing that Australian universities should be considering. But around vocational education, suppliers can own up to 67% of investments in the work training sector, which is really great. That's an increase from, I think it was previously 49%. And they can also establish themselves anywhere in Indonesia. And the requirements for Australian trainers will be accepted throughout the country. So going back. So these providers can actually deliver Australian qualifications through the Australian Qualifications Framework, as well as the Indonesian Qualifications Framework from levels 1 to 5. So those are things like certificates 1, 2, 3, 4, and diplomas and that sort of thing. And it's in a range of subject matters, which include things like tourism, which is a key area for economic recovery. So I've listed some other initiatives within the agreement on this slide, but I won't go into too much detail as international borders are still closed, unfortunately, and these programs are very reliant on people movement between the two countries. However, these are initiatives to look forward to when borders do open, because there will be opportunities for Indonesians to come to Australia and Australians to come to Indonesia, which is very exciting. So the demand for Australian education and skills is high, it still remains high. And there's still interest from Indonesian students to study at international institutions. And if we compare Australia to other international markets, we see that Australia is the #1 destination for Indonesian students. And that's not only linked to the reputation of Australian institutions in Indonesia, but also more practical considerations such as proximity to Indonesia. If we're looking at how COVID has impacted this sector, in 2019, at the end of 2019, October 2019, Australia had over 17,000 international students studying at its institutions, and that's actually including not just tertiary students, but schools and VET and ELICOS and non-award programs. So that's a pretty high number. Around 80% of these students were actually only studying in 2 states, so that's in Victoria and New South Wales, and majority of these students are studying at higher education and vocational education institutions. And since the pandemic, there has been a steady decline in the enrolments of these students because they're simply just unable to travel to Australia to study onshore. But there has also, for the cohort that are still studying at these institutions, has been an increase in the number of students studying offshore, so that's studying online. So students who are studying and enrolled in an Australian institution coming back to Indonesia, continuing their studies but doing it online. So the split of these students is about 70% of these students studying in Australia and 30% studying in Indonesia. So that's something to note around how COVID has impacted. But the good thing is that there are still students who are undertaking remote learning. So what are the opportunities for Australian skills providers in Indonesia? The opportunity is significant, and that's due to the large student population in Indonesia, and Andre touched on this a little bit earlier. So statistics from the Ministry of Education and Culture and the Ministry of Research and Technology indicate that there were over 8 million students studying at institutions in 2019. If we compare that to numbers in Australia, it's significantly larger. A large percentage of these students did attend university, but that doesn't mean all of these students were studying degree programs. And it's because of this, I think there's a large opportunity in vocational education and training. So why do I highlight this? Really, the number of Indonesian international students traveling overseas to study, and not only Australian institutions, but institutions offshore around the world generally, has not significantly increased over the last 20 years. And if we do compare that to, say, the number of Chinese or Indian students, especially looking at Australia, the numbers are not as high. So this indicates that the market size of Indonesian students willing to pay for and travel for a full international degree is limited, and students and their parents will be more cautious of offshore study just due to the pandemic going forward. Overall, as Australia has handled the pandemic well in the global context, interest in studying at Australian institutions is still going to be quite high, but there will be scope for institutions to deliver courses in Indonesia to meet the needs of Indonesian industry. Indonesia's President Joko Widodo has said on numerous occasions, a core focus of his government is increasing human resource development. And while there are well-known initiatives such as Indonesia's Endowment Fund for Education, or LPDP, through the Ministry of Finance, which sends high-achieving students to top 200 universities around the world, including to Australian universities, the number of students actually able to undertake these sorts of scholarship programs is limited because it's just expensive to study postgraduate degrees at these institutions. And not everybody can get into those universities. So this indicates that when the Indonesian government is referring to upskilling its workforce, they're really talking about vocational education and training opportunities and not necessarily university level degree qualifications. So looking towards sectors in need of upskilling includes the hospitality and tourism sector. Indonesia is heavily reliant on this sector, and due to the travel restrictions, as I mentioned earlier, 100% of the Australian tourist market has left. And this is a concern as well because women represent a majority of workers in this sector, and we know that the pandemic has had an unfair impact on women compared to men. So for those working in this sector, as we're now sort of entering into the phase where Indonesia is seeking to bring back international tourism, it does represent an area where demand for skills is likely to increase. Again, women are always at the front line of healthcare. So similarly in the healthcare sector, there is an increased need for training, and there will be an increased need for digital skills in the health system. And Australia is really well placed to deliver solutions in this area, as Australian providers are world renowned not just for the response to COVID, but for health and wellbeing in general. So I would encourage any Australian institution looking at delivering in Indonesia to consider gender and social inclusion in their design as well, as there's a huge potential to make impactful change in this area for Indonesia, and the demand for skills is just likely to increase. So the key sort of takeaways are, because bilateral service exports have been really impacted by COVID around tourism, around education services in both countries, providers should consider methods of online delivery where face-to-face delivery is just not possible, and focus on building that long-term human capacity through skills development in key recovery areas. So this is going to be a focus of the Indonesian government and the Australian government, and it's something that I would really encourage providers to consider. And just towards the end of this, does the presence of Australian education providers actually improve the quality of education services in countries outside of Australia? I think we can see, over time, there have been several Australian institutions that have established campuses and facilities overseas. And this year, obviously, Indonesia is getting its first Australian university after it diversified its policies around foreign education institutions in 2018. And it's very exciting that Monash University will be delivering postgraduate courses to Indonesian students from October this year in key areas which are highlighted here. But there are many success stories of Monash and other universities establishing a presence offshore, including in Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, and we sort of touched on that a little bit earlier. And in terms of whether these institutions have had an impact on the quality of education services delivered in these countries, I think you simply need to look at the enrollment numbers and the student satisfaction surveys, which are overall pretty favourable. I think there's a big draw card for students undertaking courses at these foreign campuses, the course fees and the cost of living, studying at these Australian institutions in their home countries compared to the Australian campus is a lot lower, and students are generally graduating with an Australian qualification still. And there are more streamlined opportunities for students to undertake periods of study in Australia, which are all really kind of big things. When you're a university student, you want to have that international experience, which is really exciting. And on top of this, you know, it does increase collaboration between that Australian institution and local institutions, which does have a marked impact on global education rankings. And we saw earlier with Malaysia. And I think Vietnam will be another country that will be really increasing in the next couple of years in terms of its, you know, global ranking for education, because it does have several Australian institutions that have established itself over the last couple of years. So, how can Indonesia attract high quality Australian skills providers? I would say that establishing a new campus in your home country, let alone outside of your home country, is a pretty costly exercise. And I think it's one of the core reasons why a number of other prominent Australian universities don't yet have a foreign presence. So I'd say that the Indonesian government needs to provide confidence to the market that Indonesia is a suitable place to invest, and that I do suspect it probably will be some time before we see another education provider invest in the same way as Monash. The nature of the education landscape is changing. More students are willing to study online. Many institutions have stopped the development of new facilities because they simply anticipate less students to be studying on campus. But I can foresee education providers still coming to Indonesia to deliver education, and it would be a huge loss of an opportunity if they didn't. But, you know, they may not be necessarily investing in large buildings where they can house hundreds or thousands of students in lecture theatres. But instead, I think they'll be delivering content using a blended approach, you know, both online and face-to-face. They'll be working with industry, using industry facilities for practical training and that sort of thing. So I think as long as Indonesia continues to push that and continues to provide confidence to the market that this is a really great opportunity for providers to establish themselves in, I think, you know, they should just keep at that. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation. Hopefully I didn't go too long, but yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing more in the Q&A and addressing people's questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clarice, for the very comprehensive presentation about Catalyst and also what the IA-CEPA could bring for the education powerhouse. And there's so many interesting takeaways from your presentation that actually also resembles with Mas Andre's presentation, especially in the last part when you also mentioned that regulatory certainty also important to establish more cooperation between two countries. In this case, between Indonesia and also Australia. And then before we pass to our next speakers, I think we can, we already have several questions, and I will pass the question first to Mas Andre. This is one coming from Tim Martin from Austrade, Jakarta. Hi, Pak Andre, great presentation. Employers in Indonesia are demanding better skilled employees. By focusing on higher education institutions, do we risk ignoring the larger need, which is for practical or vocational training to meet the needs of Indonesia's economy? Okay, I think you can answering the question.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, for the question. And just it's a little bit of a qualifier, right? Of course, this paper takes some time to develop, right? And when we're developing this paper, actually, we're looking, the point of view is which are the sectors that is most ready to do this and have the best provision. I think Clarice already highlighted, right, that vocational education actually in IA-CEPA still have foreign ownership restriction. It's increased, but it still has restriction. On the other hand, higher education doesn't. It's allowed for like a full ownership, right? So that's why we chose to focus. It's not to say that we are not saying that vocational education has big opportunities. Definitely it is. It's just that our paper chose to focus on this really low-hanging fruit, if you want to, you know, get the term there. And the really low, the lower hanging fruit here is higher education compared to vocational education. There's still a little bit of a hoop to jump through in terms of the vocational education. And I think also there's there's definitely real demand already in terms of universities, Australian universities. The market is basically ready to accept that. While in the vocational, you probably still need to do a little bit more work in bumping up the sort of like the Australian perception in the vocational education. Right? So that's definitely, but now if you look at the omnibus law, actually even TVET, it's not there, right? So it is implicitly, it's open. It's that 67% no longer applies because, you know, you can choose which one you want to go under, right? IA-CEPA or the investment law. So it is open. Like Indonesia is opening up for human capital development, and I think, yeah, delivery model will be a question. Definitely, the Clarice highlight that. But the time is now really to act. The time is now. Otherwise, other countries will just start flying in as well. They will start setting up things here, and before you know it, you'll be left in the dust if you don't do anything. So that's my opinion.
Okay, thank you so much, Mas Agri, for your answer. Hope it also answered the team's questions. And yeah, for the next one, I think I would like to share an update from the panelists, to all the panelists and also for the participants that are already joining us today. So we received the news that the representative from Ministry of Education and Culture had to cancel their participation today due to the sudden appointment. Hence, we will proceed to the Q&A sessions right away. So yeah, I think I will take another questions that already placed in the box. So for the next one, it's from Sri Raharjo. It's from private sector. The question is to addressing to all panelists. So this is a very good initiative to develop education in Indonesia. And in my opinion, the objective is to provide high quality education and affordable education. So the key word is to high quality and affordable. Because of that, in my opinion, it needs to be supported by the combination of government policy and suitable education business model. For example, because of pandemic, many students in Indonesia start to get used by online learning model, at least the hybrid one. And this is very good to create operational effectiveness to reduce the cost so that the cost of education is more affordable. So my question to all the panelists is, how do you see that condition and what is your strategy to penetrate the Indonesian market? I will ask this first to Clarice and then perhaps Mas Andre can also answer that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's the question that everybody is asking. How can Australian providers enter the Indonesian market, and what is the best, model to go with? We touched on varying business models. Is it better to establish a campus? Is it better to deliver online and that sort of thing? So I think every institution who is interested in Indonesia is asking that question for themselves. I think there are a lot of opportunities in being able to deliver online because there's a cohort of students that we previously were not able to access, essentially. So if you think of students out in places around Eastern Indonesia, previously they would have had to travel to Jakarta or Bandung or Yogyakarta to receive, that higher quality and higher level of education because, they're the cities where the most famous universities in Indonesia are, or they would have had to travel overseas. But now we're kind of confronted with an opportunity to actually make impact for these minority groups and people who previously didn't have access to that kind of education through online delivery. So I would say that if there are any providers who are looking at those areas of Indonesia and, do have courses that those students might be interested in enrolling in, this is a really good opportunity. And as Pa Andre said, this is kind of the time to capitalize on this because students are going, oh, okay, I did want to study face-to-face on campus, but now I might study online. So there's a huge opportunity there that, Australian providers should really consider. Of course, it's much harder to do in reality than, talking about it in a sort of theoretical sense. You do have to consider the right kind of length of the program, the cost of the program. You said affordability is an issue. absolutely. Australian institutions are providing high quality courses, and those, courses are costed at an appropriate price for their institution. So that might be an expense that certain students are not able to cover, but that's just the reality of the sort of education space we're working in. But yeah, there are lots of opportunities in that, and yeah, it's really up to the institution as to determine what is the model that they want to bring to Indonesia and how they want to deliver. But there's lots of different models. So that probably doesn't really answer your question, but the Indonesian education system is complex, and there are so many opportunities in many different sectors, and there's many different models that that they can implement in Indonesia.
From my perspective, again, echoing what Clarice said, even the education providers are trying to find an operational model post-pandemic, right? I mean, the pandemic just changed a lot of things, right? So it's not just because Australian education provider wants to come to Indonesia, they need to consider a new model. No, it's just the pandemic in general, right? So it definitely universities are trying the online model, the hybrid model, and see how it works. A lot of the complaints I've heard from students is that when they engage with foreign universities, they're looking for the experience as well, the lived experience of studying overseas, living abroad. So of course that become absent, right? But as you see, Indonesia, a lot of students prefer to study in Indonesia for whatever reason, right? So just by this university setting up in Indonesia is already in a way addressing that, right? Like halfway meeting that demand, right? And I do believe that if you a lot of students that I know that studies in Malaysia, because I was in Malaysia for quite a while also, foreign students and Indonesian students study in Malaysia, in the Monash or the Swinburne there, because it's cheaper to do so compared to going to Australia, studying there, right? So that already, there's a cost reduction there. If they can do it in Indonesia, they'll probably even be cheaper, right? I mean, you don't have to pay for rental, for example, house rental, things like that. So affordability is not just the tuition, but it's also the whole spectrum of living costs, right? And definitely online is an option. And I do believe that the flexibility of universities to offer both physical, in person and online, and probably even some universities can try partnering up with Indonesian education provider to provide like a quasi online class. So it's like, the lecturer on the screen, but you get to sit in the classroom. That gives that kind of like, that kind of feeling that I'm still studying in person, interacting with my peers, but the lecturer is just beamed in from Australia. And so those are possible models, and there's just, it's being explored now. I think Australian provider can also provide single courses, just like the MOOC system, the massive online learning module, so through the Indonesian education digital education platforms, it's possible. We have that, and that's supported by the government through the Kartu Prakerja as well, right? So those are, TVET providers can create this module, sell it through the Indonesian digital provider. So that's also an option. And then it's up in the air. It's just up to the creativity of the providers to explore that, to be honest.
And I might add on here, we've been talking about, individual students enrolling in a course, and students who are at university age and that sort of thing. There is a huge opportunity here, though, for students who are outside of that bracket. Students who are, or people who are employed and who are working and who are mature age, who want to upskill or who need to upskill to respond to advances in Industry 4.0 and that sort of thing. Companies, they need to be on top of making sure their employees are skilled enough for the jobs that they're doing. So there is a big opportunity for companies to be working with providers to deliver courses for their staff, and for these staff to do short courses, long courses, whatever it is that they need, so that they do have the skills and so that they feel that they can, do their job and that they have the latest training available to them. So that is another area that I think, Australia and Indonesia need to work together on, and it presents a really significant opportunity. Think of how many companies in Indonesia are delivering, internal training modules. They could easily work with an international provider, with an Australian provider to do that. And I think that would be a really good opportunity for many people.
Okay, thank you so much, Mas Andre, and also Clarice, for your takes on the question. And then there are also several questions coming in. Okay, the next one is from Diah Kusumaningtyas. According to the Omnibus Law, foreign investment on education are only allowed in special economic zone. Is there a special arrangement under IA-CEPA to facilitate Australian university to be established outside the special economic zone? I think, yeah, Mas Andre.
Yeah. So as far as I know, when the sector is listed in the IA-CEPA, it does not have a locational restriction, right? So that's why I say, as I mentioned with Tim, it just seems to be really good, the terms and conditions, right? So yeah, but even in the Omnibus Law itself, it still says a special economic zone, but there's been talks that, this might be also reformed and just open for all. But at the moment, Australian universities have that advantage, still have the advantage of you can set up anywhere. I mean, Monash is definitely not in a special economic zone, right? So that's just one example.
Okay, thank you so much, Mas Andre. Do Clarice also have takes on this, or would you like to pass on for the next question?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andre has summarized it well. Obviously, Monash is not in this zone. So that's an example of universities being able to establish outside of these. And I think that's good, because that will be a consideration for any university who's looking at Indonesia if they're restricted to only establishing in a location because that is the identified zone for whatever reason. That might be a deterrent. And you don't want them, you don't want these institutions to be deterred from investing. You want them to be investing. So yeah, that's my comment.
Okay, thank you so much, Clarice. So from the chat box, I think I also see a question is from Bella Dewanti, Parayan Catholic University, to Mas Andre Suryanto and also Clarice Campbell. So the question, I think Australian education costs are expensive for Indonesians. How do the Indonesian and Australian governments respond to this problem? Given that Indian students studying abroad continue to increase, even though the economic situation is similar with Indonesia. So perhaps I can ask this to Clarice first, and then to Mas Andre.
Sure. Yeah, it's a tough question. I think at the end of the day, the reason why we have more Indian students studying in Australia is because there are more Indians in general compared to Indonesians. I think we have to consider the population dynamics there. But I would say on top of that, for many students, they're making that personal decision, do I want to study overseas or not? It's up to the individual as to whether they have the capacity to afford that or not. But I said earlier, really the number of Indonesian students over the last 20 years who are studying offshore, who are studying outside of Indonesia, hasn't increased drastically. So the market size is pretty much the same. Who knows how that will be after the pandemic. But the opportunity is for the Australian providers to come and deliver Australian education in Indonesia, not necessarily for Indonesian students to be studying at Australian institutions in Australia. And that can have an impact on the course costs. So like we said earlier, for those students studying at Australian institutions in Malaysia, it costs less to study at those institutions than it does to study at the same institutions in Australia. And that's just not the course fee only, but it's also the living cost. You've got to think of this as a sort of package. But the opportunity is also in that you don't necessarily have to do a full degree. So the costs again are cheaper because you're not studying for 3 full years. You're not paying 3 years worth of university costs. So that can bring the price down as well. So there are lots of ways to increase this collaboration, and cost is always going to be something that students will consider that determines why they select a particular university or why they study overseas or why they don't study overseas and that sort of thing. But I think as Australian providers start considering Indonesia a little bit more, they start altering their method of delivery, the courses start becoming shorter or less intense, you know, the costs will be altered because of that. And that's a good thing, because then more Indonesians will have the opportunity to enroll in these courses to have that experience of studying with an Australian provider. So that's my comment.
Yeah, I think I pretty much have the same thoughts with Clarice as well. And when we say Australian education costs are expensive, right? And really, the decision to study overseas rests in the hands of the students, right? They're the one who calculate all the costs, things like that. But I think what Indonesian government is doing now in terms of opening up the sector for foreign universities is to partly address that cost issue, right? Because when you welcome more higher quality institution, not to say that they will do it cheap, of course, like they still have their cost structure and they have, but at least that will increase the quality of education, so you get more value for money for whatever you pay for. And definitely when you're doing it in Indonesia, of course you will hire Indonesian lecturers, not really just fly in lecturer in and out, right? That's just not really sustainable business model, even they're open in Indonesia. So of course then labor costs will be lower. And yeah, I think that's part of the idea, is actually to lower the cost threshold of getting Australian qualification in Indonesia. And that helps. I think there was another question about inclusivity. And I think that actually will improve inclusivity because as there's more education providers, I mean, that 16% number might be because there's just not enough space. Well, there's more space now, so you can get more students enrolled. And of course, there's lower cost space now to those that wants to get sort of foreign, internationally renowned degree, right? So definitely will increase inclusivity. And as I say, in the Malaysian experience, right? So the local universities turn out that they also increase their quality, right? Probably by maintaining the price to be competitive, or probably even lowering, right? But the quality is higher because they know that they need to compete now with, you know, higher quality institutions, right? So it just by allowing more universities to set up, right, regardless if it's domestic or foreign, of course, with good quality, with good standards, then you will automatically improve inclusivity, in my opinion. So that will be my answer.
Thank you, Clarice, and also Mas Andre, and also Mas Andre's answer actually answering another question coming from Alvin in the chat, in the Q&A box, because he also asked related to how the existence of international university could encourage the inclusive education within the country, and I think you already answered that beforehand. So yeah, I also encourage other participants, if you still have a question, you can ask using the Q&A feature in your Zoom platform. And then I also have a question. So related to this, because we already talked about the higher education and also vocational education, is there any possibility to expand the education powerhouse beyond higher education and also TVET in the coming future through this IA-CEPA? Perhaps I can ask first to Clarice and then Mas Andre next.
Yes, I think there is scope to expand this beyond higher education and TVET, because as I said earlier, students and employers are sort of looking for smaller, shorter courses so that people can be upskilled quickly. We're sort of moving into a phase where less people want to do a really long university degree. They could be working and they just need a couple weeks or a couple of months to do a course where they get to the next level, which allows them to prove to their employer that they do have the skills and that they can move into the next job, or that they can apply for a different job at a different company. So this is an area that I think is going to only increase between Australia and Indonesia. So TVET providers are now delivering things called micro-credentials. So you do a short course. It's in an area that is quick, short and sharp, so that you do have that, you know, certificate at the end that you can say, hey, yes, I've done this digital skills course, or I've done this health course, or whatever it is. And that's going to be increasingly popular. We've already seen that education technology platforms have exploded over the last 12 months because of COVID. People are looking online, how can I do a data science course really quickly that doesn't take very long? So there are many, many examples of these edtech platforms that people can go onto. They can do a free course, they can, you know, pay for a certificate at the end, they can do all of those sorts of things. And between Indonesia and Australia, I think that's going to become much more common and much more, you know, of an area of collaboration. Outside of that, you know, English language is always going to be an area of cooperation between our two countries. You know, all of my Indonesian friends want to practice their English with me. I know that they've done their IELTS and all of that sort of thing. So that's, you know, something that Indonesian students will always look towards Australia, because it's just cheaper to study in Australia to do their English language training than it is in the UK, and things like that. It's just so much further away. So that's also another area that's always going to be there, and is an opportunity for our two countries to collaborate on. And of course, then there's a sort of school sector and things like that. A lot of high school students are now sort of looking at Australia as to whether they can do their high certificate certification there. And also Australian high schools are actually, you know, starting to deliver high school certificates in Indonesia and in other places around the world. If you go to the Australian International School, you will graduate with a certificate, you know, as if you've done high school in Australia and things like that. So there are other examples of areas that we can collaborate on that are outside of the traditional tertiary and vocational education and training.
Yeah, since Clarice has gone through the education side, I'm actually more gonna look at another side of human capital development. I mean, Clarice actually went through that briefly, right? And to be honest with you, when I look at IA-CEPA, I got very excited about the human capital part, because there's just so much there. Right? I mean, what we have in the paper was just like just a teaser, you know. It's like you know, the work exchange program. Those are really, really good programs to, you know, upskill those adults that's already in their job, wants to get more experience working overseas. They can get the skills exchange program. That was very exciting for me. And also there's this internship program also, allowed for internship program. So these are really practical. So just beyond education, but still within the human capital development, right? And I think that's, I know the pandemic has stopped that, but really these are the areas that should be focused, worked on since now, so that once the border open, we can just fully utilize that. And even the work holiday visa requirement. I mean, Australia is in desperate need for all these work holiday workers. The agricultural sector is facing a lot of problems because they cannot get enough workers, right? So it's the sector that's very ready, and we just need to figure out, of course, all the quarantine arrangements, this and that. But those are really exciting part of the IA-CEPA that I see on the human capital. There's a lot of focus, there's a lot of opportunity for Indonesian and Australian to engage on a personal level, on the education, skills development. And of course, you know, I think it just needs which one we want to focus on, right? And I do believe those are those spaces. It's there, the agreement has those side letters, there's commitment there. You just need to push it through. So that's my opinion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mas Andre, and also Clarice. I think I have the last question coming in from Eugene Sebastian. It is addressed to Clarice. So, are you aware of examples of how other countries engaging Indonesia in the vocational education sector and the type of models they are using?
Yes, that's a really good question, Eugene. I think there are some very well-known examples of this are from countries like Germany and Korea. I mean, those two countries are well known for their vocational education and training system to start with. Many people travel to Germany and Korea to do TVET qualifications, and they're really seen as countries that lead in this space as well, alongside Australia. But these countries also have, I guess, you know, a significant interest in Indonesia because they have a significant number of companies who are here in Indonesia, who are operating here in Indonesia. I think Korean expatriates are one of the largest expatriate groups here in Indonesia. And so there is a real almost vested interest for Korean TVET providers to be delivering training for Korean companies who are based here in Indonesia to their Indonesian employees. So that is a very common practice at many companies. And, you know, that's in really large sectors like the mining sector and manufacturing and that sort of thing. So there are examples of countries that are already in Indonesia who are assisting with this, you know, upskilling the Indonesian workforce. Australia could potentially absolutely do the same thing. They can work with companies, whether they're Australian or not, to deliver courses to staff at these companies in a range of sectors. And that's something that that Australian TVET providers should be considering when they're looking at Indonesia. It's not just how do we attract one student to enroll in one course and, you know, slowly, incrementally increase the number of students. You know, large companies in Indonesia can have thousands of employees. So deliver to those cohorts of people that are waiting to be upskilled. I think that's where the opportunity really lies. And I think Korea and Germany are examples of countries that do it quite well.
Thank you so much, Clarice. That's really interesting takes for the question. And yeah, I think that's all to wrap up our discussion today. So to summarize today's discussion, I think I can highlight from Mas Andre's presentation that by having the IA-CEPA took in place, we also have the opportunity to build the education powerhouse, not only focusing between the two countries, between Indonesia and Australia, but also like in regional setting as well. And then to do so, there are still many things that to be upgraded in terms of domestic regulations and also cooperation between the private sector and also the government itself. And looking forward to it, we also need to calculate like the evaluation process, and before we are going forward, like perhaps replicating this model with another countries perhaps or other regions in the coming years to come. And then from Clarice, we also know that Catalyst also have the initial skills focuses areas for the three areas. It's like in the digital economy, healthcare, and also the tourism for this year, but it also will expand in the coming years. And then the focus not only for the higher education, but also for TVET or the vocational training. So it will not only target the university students or who are looking for that, but also for the early career professionals who would like to increase their skills and capability in wide range of issues. And that's the projects from the Catalyst can also help with that. And then, yeah, from all, we also got the urgency for regulatory certainty. So it's really need to be upheld by both countries, whether for the Indonesia itself and also for the Australia. So this program can also working for the people. And thank you to all panelists for your time. And also thank you for the participants for watching today's webinar in Zoom and also from YouTube channel. I will return today's session to our host, Dira. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinkan, for leading our discussion today. And also thank you to Mas Andre and Clarice for your participation in today's webinar. Although the representative of Ministry of Education and Culture cannot attend our activity today, I hope the discussion between Mas Andre and Clarice provides fruitful information for all participants. Before we close our webinar today, I would like to share some information about our upcoming events and about the paper that we have just released. So first, our paper titled IA-CEPA, Building the Powerhouse. You can download it through the link provided on your screen. You can also scan the QR code that is on the screen, and I will also share it in our chat box later on. And then we have great news. We're very proud to announce that CIPS will co-organize a series of virtual events called Indonesia Policy Dialogue, where we invite higher ranked government officials to discuss policy issues. In kickoff the event, we will invite Bapak Muhammad Lutfi, the Minister of Trade, to discuss about trade regulations in Indonesia. You can go to the link on the screen to register, or you can also follow our social media account so you won't miss any other information about that. And secondly, we are still continuing the discussion on building the powerhouse, this time in the F&B sector. We will have our board member, Pak Arianto Patundu, who will become the speaker from CIPS, and also representative from Ministry of Trade and also the Australian Embassy. You can register to the event on the links provided on the screen, and I will also share it in the chat box below. And lastly, don't forget to follow our social media accounts so you won't miss any information about our events. A little bit of hint as well. Next week, we are going to have another webinar to discuss sugar trades and strategies to increase local sugar production in Indonesia. CIPS, you can just follow it on our social media accounts so you won't miss any information. And lastly, CIPS is an independent and non-profit organization. You can become our supporter by donating as little as 10,000 rupiah, and you can become a part of our membership circle. You can donate by scanning the QR code with an e-wallet of your choice. And also don't forget to go to id.chips-indonesia.org/donate to know more about how to become our supporter. And that is all the information that I have shared today. We hope today's discussion will enlighten you to the opportunities arising from creating an education powerhouse through the IA-CEPA. Thank you, and we hope we are all staying healthy during this pandemic. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.